And we are live on YouTube. And now I will let everybody in, whoever is with us tonight. Good evening, everyone. If you're just joining us, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. Doors are open. It'll take a few minutes to let everybody in. Welcome. You're just joining us. Again, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We'll get started in a few minutes. Thanks for joining us. Give it another couple minutes and then we'll get started. Thanks everybody for joining us on a rainy evening.
Matt, do you want to adjust the chat settings while we're waiting?
Good idea. Give it one more minute or wait till the magic number of my choosing. And there it is, the magic number. All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Matt Losack. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. With us this evening are our staff, David Mullins, our outreach director, Emily Towie, our outreach coordinator, Tim Wong, outreach coordinator, Pat Beckham, who is an outreach coordinator, and our new person, Max Wilberg, who is the Governor Wes Moore's Maryland Service Corps program intern with us this summer and for the next year. We welcome Max and glad he's with us and he'll be listening in. This is his first town hall, so be gentle. We are going to wait and see if our special guest, the director of the Office of Human Rights, James Stowe, is able to join us. He was on a flight this evening and intended to land in time to join us, but the weather's been bad and I'm not sure whether he'll make it. So we're going to discuss a few other things of importance. If and when James is able to hop on, then we'll go to him. If not, we'll save his attendance for a future town hall. As you know, the Renters Alliance has been advocating for renter protection legislation for at least 15 years. And some of the fundamental legislation like rent stabilization, increased code enforcement, and improved government services to enforce our rights have been part of what we've been working on all along. Another piece of important legislation was the Home Act, which made it illegal for landlords to discriminate against renters based on the source of their income. We had seen many landlords who were targeting people who were on housing vouchers or Social Security or some other source of income that they thought correlated to a tenant that they didn't want to have in their midst. And unfortunately, that often meant it became a backdoor to racial and ethnic discrimination as well. So we supported that legislation, the Home Act that passed a few years ago, and so it is now illegal for a landlord to discriminate against a tenant based on the source of their income. That had always been the case in Montgomery County, by the way, but it had not been true throughout the state of Maryland. But Maryland in general has not been a very strong legal infrastructure protecting renters. This has only been a very new movement that we are the first and only regional nonprofit dedicated exclusively to renter outreach, education, organizing, and advocacy. And when we came along, the other organizations that have been involved in this for a little bit, somewhat working to advance renters' rights, began to come together into a larger movement and awareness that there's a growing number of renters in the state of Maryland that are vulnerable to housing instability. Yet we still have a long, long way to go. We did pass rent stabilization in Montgomery County, not in Gaithersburg, not in Rockville, but in Montgomery County outside of those municipalities. Prince George's County just passed a rent stabilization program. And I believe staff, was there another one? Was it Baltimore City or another part of the state?
Mount Rainier.
Mount Rainier, I think, is that Prince George's?
It's its own municipality, I think, kind of like Hyattsville, which maybe Hyattsville did too, excuse me. But yeah, Prince George's County certainly did, though, as a county.
The point being that rent stabilization, where it was once thought that it would never pass, has now gotten some traction in two of the largest counties in the state and in other municipalities in the state. And the rest of the municipalities are looking at that kind of renter protection so that we can address some of these rent increase gouging that we've seen, some of it in the double digits that are pricing people out of their homes. I always like to remind everybody that while we are pleased that the rent stabilization program was enacted in Montgomery County, it is a long way from what we wanted. It does cap rents at 6%, but that's a lot of money for a lot of people who don't see annual 6% increases in their income. And so while it staves off some of that gouging, it doesn't stop what we consider excessive rent increases. It also, unfortunately, thanks to an amendment by Councilmember Dawn Lutke, that allowed for buildings built in the last 23 years to be exempt from this legislation. So if your building was built 22 years ago, it has one more year of exemption. If it was built this year, it has 23 years of exemption. The Renters Alliance supports this idea that if you invest a lot of money in building an apartment building, you should be able to make it back and make a profit. So we accept that principle, but we're not sure that you need 23 years to do it. And so we thought it was rather arbitrary. And maybe down the road, we'll be able to fix that in the legislation. And then the other part was that small landlords, I believe, less than 2 or fewer units that they own are also exempt. And again, we oppose that amendment by Councilmember Dawn Lutke because we don't think that small landlords have any less responsibility for the quality and stability of the tenants that they are leasing their apartments to. So we don't get it. And unfortunately, tens of thousands of residents in Montgomery County live in small landlord properties and rent there. So that's a problem. Nevertheless, we have seen some progress in creating renter protections. However, there was one gaping hole in the vulnerability of tenants in the state of Maryland, a vulnerability that does not exist in places like Washington, D.C. and New York and California and other parts of the United States that have had long-standing renter communities. Maryland has been historically a rural state with, with the exception of Baltimore City, and but the rural suburb to Washington, D.C. But in the last 50 years or so, places like Silver Spring and Bethesda, Rockville, and now Prince George's County and others have become urbanized and have increasing numbers of people living in rental housing, not just as a temporary station on the way to owning, but as a way of life for the rest of their lives. But the infrastructure that protects us has not caught up yet. So the big gaping hole is that we have not seen the enactment yet of just cause eviction protection. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, just cause eviction protection means, if we had it, that a landlord would have to provide a justifiable reason not to renew your lease when your lease term comes to an end. Right now, with just 60 days notice, a landlord can issue what's known as a notice to vacate at the end of your lease, saying they're not going to renew the lease. And unfortunately, the tenant has very little defense against that. And when the tenant stays one day longer than the term of that lease, having received 60 days notice, they become what's known as tenant holding over. So then the landlord can sue for eviction for tenant holding over. And when you go to court to try to defend against it, the only thing that the judge will ask is whether or not the tenant got 60 days notice. Now, it is illegal to retaliate against a tenant. It is illegal to discriminate against a tenant based on their race or some other protected class. But the ability of the tenant to prove that that is the motivation behind the notice to vacate is extremely difficult. And so we're seeing an increasing number of landlords take advantage of that provision in the law that protects the landlord, not the tenant, and allows them to circumvent a good faith eviction process where they would have to say, this is a good reason to evict somebody to a judge. And the judge would probably, would ask to prove it and then agree whether or not it is a justifiable eviction. But without having to state a reason, tenants are extremely vulnerable to racial discrimination, to retaliation for seeking promised or required services, for forming tenants associations, for trying to negotiate a lower rent, for complaining to code enforcement or the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs about violations to their rights or maintenance issues or any other pursuit of their rights in the building that the property manager or the landlord doesn't like. That is perfectly within the tenant's right to pursue, but they could be made vulnerable to eviction because of the lack of just cause eviction protection. Now, we've been working on getting that legislation passed since we were founded in 2010. One of our longstanding board members, who's now a state delegate, Janelle Wilkins, has put forward this legislation year in and year out. And by the way, before that, we had other friends in the state delegation who had also proposed this, including now Congressman Jamie Raskin when he was a state senator, and others. But now Janelle has taken the lead on this. And she first put in a legislation that would have made it possible for Montgomery County to have that protection. And that was blocked in the House of Delegates by the chair of the Housing Committee, Kumar Barve, who's no longer that chair. And for years that was blocked. And then it was decided that we would do a statewide just cause eviction protection, and that was blocked. And then it was determined that we would provide local enabling legislation. Because eviction law is state law, it requires the House of Delegates, the Maryland General Assembly, to either enable or approve or authorize a local municipality to enact it if they so choose, or to make it state law. So this bill would allow local municipalities, if it passes the General Assembly, to enact it themselves if they so choose and in any form that they choose. So it's very flexible. There are some very conservative parts of Maryland that just wouldn't want it. Maybe they don't have a whole lot of renters. They just aren't going to bother with it. Places like Baltimore and Prince George's County and Montgomery County very much do want it. The bill has gotten, over the years, a great deal of support. Renters United Maryland, which is an organization that the Renters Alliance co-founded with the Public Justice Center in Baltimore, has dozens of members who have been very supportive of it. The Maryland Association of Counties has supported it. The administration of Governor Wes Moore spoke in favor of it, testified in favor of it last year. Montgomery County's county executive and council spoke in favor of it, as did county executive from Baltimore County, I believe, and also elected officials from Prince George's County. So it's gotten, and of course, many of our friends in the labor movement, the teachers unions, the Commission on Aging, and many, many other very credible, good standing organizations in the state have given very effective and passionate support, not to mention, of course, scores of hundreds of renters who pleaded with the General Assembly to pass it. So we made some progress. It went to the new chair of the House of Delegates Committee, Housing Committee, Mark Corman, a delegate from Bethesda, I believe, championed it through the committee and did extremely well and was eloquent supporter of the legislation and got it out of his committee. It went to the House of Delegates and was voted in favor of 96 to 37. That is a historic vote for this legislation. But then it made it over to the Senate, which it has to go through as well. And our friend, Senator Will Smith, who's the chair of that committee, who supports the bill, was not able to get it to a vote. And so it did not get it to the overall Senate, and so no vote has taken place, and so it didn't get through last year. We're very, very hopeful, and in fact, we're demanding that it get through this coming legislative session. But that's going to require that all of us, everyone who supported it in the past, and even more tenants, raise their voices, organized and individual, to urge the Maryland General Assembly to pass it. And then ultimately, we believe that Governor Wes Moore will also support it, since after all, his administration testified in favor of it last year. So this is perhaps the most important piece of renter protection legislation in the state. I cannot imagine the kind of abuse, well, forgive me, I actually can imagine it because we see it, that tenants experience when they are vulnerable to being evicted without this protection. We are seeing tenants across Montgomery County who are being evicted through the tenant holding over process. We have a tenant that we are helping defend from Rive Wheaton in Wheaton, the apartment community that we believe is one of the most abusive property managements that we've ever had to work with, that was targeting tenants who were organizing tenants associations and otherwise seeking a promised or required services. And we also believe targeting lower income tenants in the building. And so we're fighting that fight. We've engaged the Public Justice Center lawyers and we filed in court. But we are a bit hamstrung without this legislation. We've also seen others around Montgomery County who are fighting this fight, who have experienced notices to vacate simply for making a complaint about maintenance in their apartment community or some other basic pursuit of their rights. And it's just unconscionable that they are not protected in law. We say very clearly that sometimes a tenant needs to be evicted. We don't like it. It is a tragedy, but sometimes we have to protect tenants against other tenants. And we can't argue against a landlord who does not receive rent. You have to pay your rent. If you don't pay your rent, ultimately, you're not going to be able to stay in your apartment. And of course, we must all agree that if a tenant has a substantial breach of their lease and does not respect the property or their neighbors or is committing crimes, that they may also need to be evicted. Just cause eviction protection does not prevent a landlord from pursuing any of those justifiable evictions. What it does prevent is abuse and retaliation. And so we hope that it gets enacted, and we hope that everybody can join in. Are there any questions or comments from our audience on this issue? Please put them in the chat if you have a question or comment.
Yeah, you
We
had, I
would-
mean, you had one on what's going on with Just Cause. So that was really what they needed, was an update. So that was good. And I was going to add just a couple process notes for those that are interested. It ended up being Good Cause as the title. They called it Good Cause Protections at the end, changed the name a little, and that's what it's called in the federal already. A lot of these buildings that get tax credits already had this built in, and so people say this would somehow disturb the market, but it's already present here. But yeah, and then the legislature elected to actually list what Matt was just going through, what some of the good causes may be, and I thought that was interesting. So we'll look for next time whether they choose to do that, or as we originally thought, just leave it completely up to the local jurisdictions.
Right. Yeah, we will see what happens. As I say, I think that Montgomery County is very strongly in support of it and would enact it relatively quickly. We do have some concerns about what would be known as a poison pill or poison amendment. We think that there's a movement among some in the Senate. Remember that there are many elected officials in the General Assembly who are themselves landlords. Or who have a great deal of interest in the landlord developer industry, or who have received campaign support from the landlord developer industry, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry against all of our voices and however much money I've got in my wallet, which is about $3. So, our ability financially to go up against a multi-billion-dollar industry is a bit difficult. However, we have the numbers. Nearly 40% of the state rents their homes. And if we all got organized and put that kind of influence on the legislative process, we should be successful. So we're getting there, but we've still got a long way to go. But the poison pill amendments might include restricting what municipalities could pass. So they might say that you can only use just cause protection for 2 or 3 things. We think that it should be that the just causes should be limited to substantial breaches of the lease or some other common sense justification. So we don't want that tampered with. We want the local municipalities to be able to pass a legislation that encompasses what the standard just causes are. And I think that we can put, if we look at PolicyLink, one of you guys, if you can look at PolicyLink Just Cause and put the link in the chat to a description of just cause eviction protection and what it normally includes in other pieces of legislation around the country. If anybody wants to look at it and really understand it, it's very, very important. There's some other legislation coming down the pike, including we believe some protections for renters who are evicted to ensure that their belongings are put in a safe place for a certain period of time so that they have a chance to retrieve them later. Evictions, as they happen now, the landlord, once you are evicted, the sheriff comes, will change the locks on the door, and the landlord will take your belongings and put them on the curb. And then they are vulnerable to anybody coming along and taking them or the weather. So this provision would provide a little bit of a respite for people who are facing that kind of difficulty by putting their belongings in a safe place or in storage for a period of time so that when they find another place, they could be able to retrieve their belongings. So any other questions on these issues? Okay, well, seeing none, then let's go into a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of tenant organizing around the way. Emily, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, sure. So, a big part we do is helping to organize tenants associations. We've been pretty active lately. Last night we had a meeting at a Bethesda apartment, the residents at Capitol Crescent Trail. Had a pretty good turnout, and so we're looking forward to to next steps with them. Their issue is their building is being renovated, and through the renovations, amenities are being reduced, but rents are still getting increased, and there's limited notification from the property management about this. So that's why the tenants wanted to come together. So we're looking to have another meeting for them and discuss next steps and solutions for living in a building that's undergoing renovations. We've also been over at Bachland Chase in Silver Spring. I know that's Tim's been taking the lead on that. Which is another big property that's also going through changes, where they're trying to convert some of the units into affordable housing units, and some current tenants would become over income for the program. So they were worried about being displaced there. So we've been meeting with them. Um, so if you live in an apartment, and you've been seeing issues going on in the building, maybe amenities being are reduced, maintenance is declining, or it doesn't have to be that. It could just be that you're new in the area and you don't really know your neighbors and you don't really know what your rights are as a renter. You don't know what increases they're allowed to charge. You don't know who to call if there's bugs in your apartment. So it could really be any reason, whether there's problems or even if there's not, we're still happy to help organize an association. We think that associations are a great way to build a collective voice when dealing with property management and even other entities. We often hear someone will complain of property management, say there's a leak or their AC is broken, something like that, or they have bugs. And the property management will tell them that they're the only ones who are complaining about that. And that can be really dismissive. And if you don't know anyone else in the building, you might think that that's the truth. So tenants association is a good way to like check in with your neighbors, and know that you're not the only one experiencing those issues and that there are resources available. It helps you stay connected with us, and we're there to support. And then we can also provide the normal resources we provide on our town halls, like how to file a complaint with code enforcement, with Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs, how to reach out to lawyers for free legal advice. So if you're in a building that doesn't have a tenants association and you think that you could benefit or your neighbors could benefit, you can send us an email or call us, and we'll put that information in the chat. And we'll help print some flyers, distribute them around the building, invite everyone to a first meeting, and then kind of give everyone just like a 101 on how to start a tenants association. And a couple of things about that. If I'll just go over a few of the rights that tenants associations have. Tenant associations are allowed to use the community room once a month, free of charge, in their building. If you want to meet more than once a month, you have to be charged the same rate as you would like if you're hosting a birthday party or something in there. They can't charge you extra just because it's for a tenants association. But the first of the month is free. Um, Along with that, tenants are also allowed to distribute freely and post in centrally located spots around the building. So if in the elevators your building post information about like events going on in the building, you can post the tenant association flyer right next to it. If there's like a community bulletin board down in the mail room, you're allowed to post there. So we're happy to help
You can also post door to door.
right, the door to door as well. So we're happy to help print up those flyers and help distribute them, to invite people to come out. Oh, and I guess a big one is, as we're speaking about just cause and the lack of just cause protections, we hear that tenants are afraid of retaliation, that, the property manager will see them walking around, flyering, or meeting downstairs in the room, talking about the issues of the building, and they're worried that they'll result in a non-renewal notice. And that is a possibility, and that's why we're stressing the importance of just cause protection so that tenants can feel completely safe from things like that. Um, so currently we are without that protection, but there are things that we can do. If you become the leader of the tenants association and you get hit with a non-renewal 3 weeks later, you could have a case for retaliation, which in general is very hard to prove because without just cause, they don't have to give you a reason for non-renewal. But if you suspect reasonably that it's for you making a complaint, it's for you being a part of the tenants association, please reach out to us, and we can help kind of guide you through that. But we definitely don't want to discourage anyone from asking for what's entitled to them and the promised services from the building because they're afraid. And that's why the strength in numbers factor really comes in with the tenants association.
And it's also because, if you were to go to a court and fight it, they'd say, well, why do you think so? And you could say, because I just formed a tenants association, as opposed to being retaliated against individually with no activity that any reasonable person would think is a reason to retaliate unfairly. Emily, you also wanted to talk a little bit about the resources that are available or lack thereof.
Yeah, so as part of our so we help do tenant organizing, but we also do eviction prevention. And this isn't for people who are like simply falling behind on their rent. You have to have either a 10-day notice that for summary ejectment, a court summons for failure to pay rent, or a court judgment, like you actually went to court and they stamped it. Or the final one would be the red and white from the sheriff, like the final card stock that comes to your door that says final notice to vacate. So those are the documents that one of those is what is required to qualify for Montgomery County's Department of Health and Human Services emergency rental assistance program. So
Sorry, the notice of intent to file summary ejectment, the 10-day notice, wouldn't it would be the summons, the
I thought
summons that comes
I,
with the actual court date.
I thought they
It,
moved it back.
They moved it back only to the summons, unfortunately,
Oh,
and
okay.
from the
Sorry.
judgment to a summons. But it's important to know that if you get summoned to court and you did not receive that 10-day notice that said they're intending to file, that if you didn't receive that at least 10 days before, then you want to flag that for one of the free lawyers that we can refer you to or something, because yeah, you're supposed to receive that by state law. And then there's also a warrant of restitution that comes before that red and white notice in the mail.
Right, and nobody knows what any of those things are, only we do. So let's go back and just untangle that just a little bit. For a long time, so people know this, before we came along, frankly, and our allies around the state, it used to be that a landlord could file in court and have you have to appear in court literally the next day. And so many tenants would receive a court summons on their door to be at court the next day, have no ability to plan, to take a day off from work. And some people would receive many of these over the course of a year. And it became very expensive and almost a kind of harassment for many tenants who, are barely paying their rent and can't miss a day of work. So our allies got together and we got legislation passed that requires a landlord to issue, as Emily and David were saying, a what's known as a 10-day notice of summary ejectment, which sounds very scary. And it looks like a very scary notice. It comes from it's a court form, and it basically says that in 10 days, your landlord is going to file in the court to have you evicted for whatever reason. Usually it's for failure to pay rent. So if you're late with your rent, that's the reason. So many people think that they're going to be evicted in 10 days, and that is not what that is. It says that the landlord is giving you a warning that in 10 days, they're going to file in court. And then the court is going to issue you a court summons, which could take a few days or longer to schedule that court time. And then what happens, David?
Well, as Emily was saying, then you'll get a judgment in court unless the rent is paid and the case is dismissed. If you're not able to make it to court, there'll be a default judgment for the landlord. Or if you go to court and you admit that the rent at issue is owed, there'll be a judgment. And then that is when the process begins to start forwarding things to the sheriff's office and eviction scheduling. And then there's there's a short period where you could try to appeal the case if you were able to find a lawyer. But a few days after that judgment, the landlord can file for the warrant of restitution, also called the writ of restitution. And that's what goes to the sheriff. And then however long it takes, after that point, an eviction can be scheduled.
And a writ of restitution is just a form. It's a fancy legal term, but it just says once the judge says, yes, I agree that the landlord has the right to evict you for whatever reason you didn't pay your rent. Then the landlord has to literally fill out a form, says, yes, I want to evict this person. And that form is called the writ of restitution or warrant of restitution
Right. And that's
to get the
exactly.
property back.
And that's the one that activates the sheriff to be able to schedule a date to repossess the property. And then when that date is actually scheduled, apparently now we hear that if they have a phone number on file, tenants may receive a call from the sheriff's office. But traditionally, what always happens is then they'll give that red and white final notice that is put on the door, like Emily said. That's when you know the eviction has been scheduled.
That's right. And of course, now you're heading down the funnel into a real crisis because once that notice is on your door, we're talking about a week, 2 weeks before the sheriff and the property staff show up and can force you out of your home and put your property on the street.
But
So Emily, then what?
sorry, it's also true though, right, that while they normally post the red and white, it's technically not required to serve the eviction because they filed the warrant. Because sometimes we see they don't put it.
Well,
Right.
they have to put the sheriff in Montgomery County will always put a red and white on the door saying that you're in the pipeline to be evicted. That's our understanding. I've never heard anybody who doesn't. But you're right, Emily, in that there are ways to still avoid the eviction even at that point, especially for failure to pay rent. The most obvious, of course, the landlord could decide not to for whatever reason, but you have a right to stay the eviction if you pay off what is owed in the summons. And you can do that right up until the sheriff arrives. But you have to be able to show that you have the money to pay off what you owe in the rent that was on the summons. So you may owe more than that, but if the summons that you went to court for was $2,500 and you have $2,500 when the sheriff arrives or pay it off before the sheriff arrives, you can stop the eviction and you have that right. However, there is one issue there that if you've had 3 judgments against you in a 12-month period, the landlord could foreclose your right of redemption. So the landlord could say, look, this is the 4th time, and I'm not going to allow you, even if you pay off the rent, to stop this eviction. So that's the only time when that right does not exist. 3 times, 3 judgments against you in a 12-month period. Hopefully, nobody out there will have that happen to them. So, Emily, you were saying.
So if you have one of those documents that we just named, not the 10 days, sorry about that. From summons on to that red and white, that is one of the documents required from Department of Health and Human Services, DHHS. The other requirements, and I'll put this link in the chat. So first you have to be a Montgomery County resident. You have to have not received an eviction prevention grant from the county, from DHHS in the last 12 months. So if you were behind in March and you had received their money then, you're going to be maxed out until next March. You have to have one of those documents that we said. But the new change is very important because it's going to exclude a lot of people, is that your household income has to be at or below 30% of the area median income. And I'm going to put a chart in the chat where you can look to see where you fall. But let me just read like an example for those who don't know. It's very low. A lot of people who it used to be at 60%. So a lot of people will qualify now. It's been cut in half. So for if you live alone, a family size of 1, 30% AMI, area median income, is $32,500. So if you make more than that and you live alone, you will be considered over income for DHHS's assistance. Oh,
All right, Department of Health and Human Services, the Montgomery County Department of Health and Human Services.
Right. And we understand that while the county might tell you that like you're over income, you might be between your other bills and maybe losing a job or someone falling ill, that you still don't have enough to pay your rent. But the county just kind of just looks at this chart because they have such limited funding and they have this cutoff point. I'll just read a couple more. If for a two-person household, so just you and someone else, 30% AMI is $37,150. So if you make 38, you are and you live with one other person, you are now considered to be over income. So we just want to remind people of like those new limitations when you hear about certain assistance programs that while there's some funds available, they are very limited. But if
And
you
much more limited than they have been in the
in the
past.
past, right, I'm sure some people here are aware, maybe even received like the COVID rent relief over the past couple years where they could clear very large balances. So now there's a 30% restriction of your income, but also usually the maximum you can receive is $3,000. So if your balance is like $10,000, um the D Department of Health and Human Services, they'll talk to you about using those funds for relocation. Um, and another important piece of information is that the county was used to be able to offer relocation could include movers and the security deposit at a new place, or like to put your things in storage while you look for a new place. They no longer cover movers or storage. The relocation will only cover the security deposit at a new place. So it becomes the tenant's responsibility while they're going through this eviction process to find a new place, apply, and get approved. They have to turn in the welcome letter from their new apartment to DHHS in order for them to approve your $3,000 check. And we're seeing this every day now, is that some people they meet the income requirements, they have the court summons, the court judgment, so they check those two boxes, and so they would qualify for that relocation money, but there's not really any resources available to assist a tenant in the search for the new apartment. So it becomes it's kind of the sole responsibility of the tenant to find that apartment, which we know in this market can be really difficult, especially if you have a judgment or even a prior eviction on your record, or if it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because if your income's low enough to qualify for the county assistance, then it's probably too low to be approved at an apartment that's going to be asking that your income is 2.5 or 3 times your rent. So we're very
I
aware.
think the term you were reaching for was a catch-22.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. So we totally understand that that's what we're dealing with, the limitations all around, and then the difficulties of finding a place. So the other side is that if your balance or your summons is low, your summons is for 2,000 or maybe only like $500 or so, um that we call it, you can pay and stay, as long as, like Matt said, you don't have 3 judgments against you in the 12-month period, and your right to redemption has been foreclosed, then you can pay and stay. Um so in order to get connected with DHHS to find out like if you're eligible and all this, so you have to meet those requirements. You can call 311. You can also go in person to one of the offices. There's one in Silver Spring, there's one in Rockville, and there's one in Germantown. You can also email. We can put all that information in chat, or you can email us and we can help connect you to them if you're not sure which office to go to. If you're not sure if you qualify, if you tell us your income or send us a picture of your court documents, we can look at it and tell you if you have the right things you need to pass like the first step of eligibility with the county.
There's good news and bad news about what Emily is describing and that we're all experiencing. And it's not really that good news, but it's some good news. The good news is that Montgomery County, one of the wealthiest counties in the United States, has more resources to help vulnerable tenants than other counties, but it is still far below what is needed, and it's far below what it used to be. So we're very concerned about what's available under any circumstance. Even when the COVID money was available, the county is not responsible for, nor can it be, a anti-poverty program in the sense of sustaining people who are in chronic financial difficulty. All it can do is provide emergency assistance or a stopgap of assistance, but that stopgap of assistance has become significantly reduced. I believe the figure, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, it was $4.5 million went to the Department of Health and Human Services, which sounds like a lot of money, but not when you have 400,000 renters in Montgomery County, and some of them are facing rent arrears in the tens of thousands of dollars. So that money goes away pretty fast. And that's why Health and Human Services really restricted the formula of what people could get and who was eligible for it. We still have some difficulty, the Renters Alliance, with that formula. I'm not sure why somebody who is of low income is more entitled to receive an emergency assistance than somebody who's just a little bit more than that low income. There are other factors like having children in the schools or being a senior citizen or other types of vulnerability that we hope HHS can become more flexible. But one of the things that we want everybody to keep remembering, right now, the county executive is going around Montgomery County holding budget meetings, public budget meetings for everybody's input on what county government should spend its money on. And while we would never suggest that it should spend hundreds of millions of dollars on rental assistance, we do think that $4.5 million is pretty low, and that this eligibility requirement is very restrictive. And, you know, for long-term tenants and our neighbors and friends, we think that there needs to be a little bit better safety net for people who are facing eviction or difficult times and need some assistance from the county. We have an interest in this. When people are unstable or children are pulled out of the schools or our seniors are fighting anxiety and fear of losing their homes, there are costs to all of us. When children can't achieve academically in school, that's a cost to us. When families are constantly anxious about their homes and their children, and they're both two working parents, and you know, we see upticks in crime. We see upticks in safety net services, and we see upticks in homeless services that we all have to pay for. Not to mention a loss of prosperity, because people invest in their communities differently and not as much when they're unstable. So one has to think about housing policy holistically. I wanted to address quickly what Emily said about once a month tenant association organizing. It's not the first of the month, it's just once a month. So you're entitled, a law that the Renters Alliance helped pass or pushed to pass with County Executive Elrich's help, that allows for tenants to organize and have a tenants association once a month in their community space at no charge. Doesn't matter when in the month, but it can only be for once a month, unless your landlord or property manager allows you to use it more often at no charge, which is great. Or it's a community space where they don't charge you anyway. But to have it private, if there's a rule about renting it for private use, the tenant association is allowed to use it once a month at no charge. Were there other questions or other comments? Emily, did you have anything else on that?
Yeah, sorry, let me add something about applying for the emergency assistance with DHHS. There I put in the chat a list of documents. So if you go in person, I like highly suggest that you look at the list and compile all your documents before you go in, because even when you go in, I want to make clear expectations for everyone. It's very unlikely that you'll be processed right then and like get a check and walk away with a check right then. It takes time. You might not even be assigned. You might speak to someone and do an initial intake, but not even be assigned to a caseworker for like 1 week. And if you've already got the red and white and you're just doing it the day you get the red and white, you might run out of time to turn in all your paperwork, get approved, get the check cut, and turn it in to your office before the sheriff comes. So a couple of notes on that. I would suggest as soon as you're entering down this process, like when you get that court summons, to contact us or DHHS or both right away to begin the process. The sooner you start, the more likely that it'll be done in time, and that, let's say your balance is high, then maybe you can be referred to like a few other resources, because each resource will take time and each resource has their own application process. So the more time you give yourself, the better. Um, and that also, if you walk in and you do an intake, but you don't meet with the caseworker and they just say like, okay, we'll call you when we have someone ready for you, make sure you get the name of whoever you spoke to. We hear a lot from tenants, like, yeah, I walked in like 2 weeks ago, someone said they call me, I don't know who. So and then it's hard to like track down that paper trail. So when you go in, bring all your documents with you. If you can get the name and the number or the email of who you spoke to, and then who should be calling you if they know who your assignment is, that's really helpful, especially if you reach out to us to follow up. We know who the contact point is, and we can find like where the gap was and reconnect you guys.
Someone asked in the chat what the eviction numbers are. I can tell you that over the last 5 or 6 years is difficult to calculate because of the pandemic. So the pandemic sort of screwed up any kind of pattern. Some of the things that we are seeing is that tenant holding over filings have increased dramatically across the state, as I said before, because landlords have decided it's a good end around to the eviction process, and they have the upper hand in that process. So rather than suing you for failure to pay rent, or because they don't like you and they don't want to say why they don't like you, or whatever, they just do the tenant holding over thing, wait to the end of your lease and give you a 60-day notice. And so we've seen quite the uptick in that. I will also point out that Maryland, unfortunately, is the #1 eviction filing state in the nation by far. I'm going to put in the chat, or if somebody can help me, I'm looking for the Princeton Eviction Lab. There it is. And you can see the national eviction graph. There it is. And that will show you where all the evictions are taking place in the United States. And you'll see this major concentration in Maryland. And one of the main reasons for that is that we have had the lowest eviction filing fee in courts anywhere in the United States. Last year, we passed some legislation that brought it up to from $15, which was nothing, to $45, which is still not significant enough to stop many landlords who are what we call them as serial filers, who are using the courts as a kind of a collection agency instead of to really, in good faith, pursue a justifiable eviction. So they're routinely filing with the courts because it's no skin off their teeth, doesn't cost them much. And we're seeing this tremendous abuse of the court system going after tenants, many of whom will eventually pay their rent, even if they're a little bit late, because a lot of people receive their Social Security late in the month and don't have a whole lot of room to pay rent in advance of their payments from Social Security or other subsidized income. So that's one reason. And sometimes it's because, you have two folks working and, it's tough. So they might be a little bit late. But we are seeing people who are having eviction filings against them for $25, for $50 at risk of losing their homes. The Eviction Lab was founded by Matthew Desmond, who wrote the seminal work Evicted, which I encourage everybody to read because it describes in detail the tremendous damage to our communities by people being evicted, oftentimes for very small amounts of money, with very, very great disastrous consequences for them and their families. Okay, on that happy note, perhaps we should go on to some other things about resources. It doesn't look like our friend James Stowe, his flight has landed, and I haven't heard from him, so I'm assuming that he's stuck at an airport. I hope he's okay, but we will have him back at a later town hall. But at all of our town halls, and by the way, again, reminder, if you have any questions or concerns about anything having to do with renting, we're here to answer those questions or follow up with you. But as we always do, let's go through some of the standard resources that are available for folks. Tim, we're going to wake you up and ask you to tell us about code enforcement.
Yeah, so if you're having issues in your apartment, like with the structure, or if your appliances aren't working, you have mold, you have a leak, things like that. So the very first thing to do is notify your manager right away. And if after a reasonable amount of time they don't do anything, then you can contact code enforcement. Now, what's a reasonable amount of time will depend on what the issue is, right? So, like, let's say you have a leak. That's a big emergency. I mean, if it's a big leak, it's like flooding your bathroom floor. It's a big emergency. They need to fix that, within 24 hours, I would say. But if it's something like, I don't know, like your rug is ripped up in a corner or something, then I would give them a little bit more time. So try to be reasonable about the amount of time you give them before you call code enforcement or contact code enforcement. But yeah, so if they don't fix it, you can call or submit like an online submission for code enforcement, and we'll link it below. But you can call 311, and that'll take you, the operator will take you to code enforcement if you tell them your issue. So and then you can make a code complaint, and they'll send an inspector out, and the inspector will kind of look at it, and if they think it's a violation of code, they'll issue notice of violation for your landlord to fix it. Now, if you live in one of the incorporated cities like Petersburg, Rockville, Tacoma Park, they should have their own code enforcement, but I believe you can go through the same channels and they'll just be redirected there. Yeah, so you all have the right to live in a safe, well-maintained place. So don't be afraid of speaking out when there's issues. And if you make a code complaint and they try to evict you, for no other reason other than you made the code complaint, then you can try to claim retaliation for that as well. Yeah, if there's any questions, put them in the chat. But we're also happy to help you. If you have a question about like a code issue in your unit, feel free to reach out. Sometimes code inspectors will need like multiple, like really need to have their hand held to kind of like solve the issue. So don't feel let down if at first it doesn't succeed. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, something that Emily said earlier too, if you make a code complaint, please find out what your case number is when you make that complaint. And if an inspector comes, take the name of that inspector. If you're satisfied with the inspector's work, great. If you're not, we can help you there and make sure that that all of us are getting the services that we're entitled to. Emily, you want to tell us about landlord tenant? Oh, sorry, Tim.
There's a question in the chat about how mold is mitigated in apartment buildings. So I think for most code issues, like let's say there's pests or mold, which I think they have like they can't call it mold per se. They have to call it some kind of like biological. It's like some weird legal terminology, but essentially when you get mold or an issue like that, they have to send someone out to look at, and they have to hire like a licensed contractor to treat it. So for mold, yeah, I mean, there's different strategies that I think they can employ. But I don't know if Matt, you have anything to add about how mold is treated in apartment buildings?
Well, it's still a difficult situation, but visible mold in the apartment it is required that the landlord remove it. And sometimes if there's a leak between the walls, that's not something that the code inspector can address. But if there's, unless you can demonstrate that there's a leak between the wall, and perhaps the code inspector could require that the landlord address that issue. But they do have to address any visible mold, and they have to mitigate it. We are always concerned if a landlord's mitigation process is simply to paint over it. So the code inspector should forbid that. And of course, you should also say that's not sufficient. Mold is a dangerous substance, and it can lead to all types of.
Take a picture.
Take a picture is a good idea. Make sure that you have evidence, but it can lead to all types of health problems if it's not mitigated. So we are seeing a lot of that, of course, with increased moisture and global warming and the rest. It has become a real problem. So don't live with it. If hopefully the landlord will work to mitigate it immediately, but if they're not responsive, then it is a code complaint that you can file. Okay, Emily.
So the other kind of complaint that wouldn't go to code, it doesn't have to do with the maintenance or condition of your property, would be all Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, also known as OLTA, complaint. So these complaints are what they sound like between landlord and tenant affairs. So a couple of examples could be you have paid your rent on time, but you keep seeing late fees come up on your account, or you are expecting to be signing a renewal notice, and your property manager has, or your landlord hasn't delivered it yet. Or there's you're being harassed by the property manager. I tend to think of them as like lease and ledger issues. Lease, the three L's, the lease, ledger, and landlord issues. So same process. First, you need to try to resolve it with property management. Like if you're noticing this late fee on your account, you take your receipt and your ledger and go down to the office and it's like, hey, I paid my rent. I have the receipt right here. Are we able to remove this charge? And if that doesn't work, then you can escalate it by filing an OLTA complaint. Same thing, you can call 311 or you can fill out the form online. I think if you fill out online, you can save a copy of your complaint for your records, which is always very helpful. And then you could also forward it to us to keep us in the know, or if you need help following up. Very similar to the code process, they will assign an investigator to look into it. Again, this can take a couple days, so they're probably not coming out to your apartment the very next day. I would allow a reasonable amount of time depending on what the issue is. And the investigator will serve as like a neutral fact finder and like a mediator. So they're not on the landlord side, they're not on your side, they're just there to like be neutral and unbiased, see as much as they can be, see what the issue is, and if and make a determination that, oh yes, the landlord that made a mistake, they were overcharging you, and then issued it, enforce that the landlord correct that mistake. And if you have a question, if you're confused, you can't find the form, or you're not sure if this would be a code or an OLTA issue, you can always call 311 or you can call us.
Did we put our 888 number in the
Yeah, it's
in
in
the
there.
chat so people can call us? Sometimes these things are confusing. We want to make sure we keep our powder dry. We don't want people to make formal complaints when some of these things can be nipped in the bud early, or discussion, or just require a little bit of strategizing before we get to a formal complaint or escalate to a formal complaint. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're a font of information. So, please give us a call if you're not sure. David Mullins, you're our expert on the Access to Counsel and Evictions program. Give us a little information on that.
Sure. Just to kind of tie it back, yeah. If you're not satisfied with the outcome of the landlord-tenant decision, if you don't feel like their mediation was, appropriate or what have you, there is a commission on landlord-tenant affairs that can then hear the case. They're a quasi-judicial county commission that has both landlords, tenants, and members of the public at large on there. again, we're glad to just kind of walk you through this if you get there. If you want to go full judicial process, these things can be in tandem or it's separate. Again, that is also possible. If you're trying to affirmatively file something like a rent escrow or something, you may want to go down to the court on the second floor at the district court in Rockville, where they have all the housing cases. On the second floor, there's a self-help center you can walk in. And then you can speak. This is more for consultation. You can speak with an attorney there about like what you might be able to file affirmatively if you think there are issues. Then if you're where we're talking about before, if you're facing eviction and either for whatever reason for rent related or like Matt was saying, if they're alleging you've breached your lease or your lease is over and you're holding over, what have you. The state of Maryland put aside funding for lawyers at local legal service providers to represent tenants that might not be able to afford a lawyer themselves. So there are income restrictions, but I'm pasting the 3 local providers here in Montgomery County that administer this program. So they do have same day representation, they call it. But as this program unfolds, we're hearing more and more from the lawyers that they can be most effective the earlier you get to them. So then, like Emily was saying before, those earlier documents that she was talking about, here are their intake lines. So you don't need to wait till you're actually in court, and you can reach out ahead of time here for an intake. Same thing as the other resources. If you're running into some issue with the intake, please let us know, because we get a chance to check in with these folks regularly and with our local providers. So please let us know. But yeah, again, this was to almost always the landlord is represented, especially from the larger properties. And so the state program is hoping that more tenants can be represented going forward. And we want to see people get connected. So please do reach out about it.
It's been a terrible tragedy for many, many years in Maryland and other parts of the country, where so many tenants are forced to go to court and have no idea how the court works, have no lawyer to represent them, while the landlord and some of these larger corporations have all the lawyers they need, and they make it very difficult for a tenant to defend themselves. And many times the tenant may have a defense that it might either delay an eviction or stop it altogether. And so having a lawyer on our side of the table is extremely important. So we're very grateful for the state of Maryland for putting this program together. It's still in the beginning phases. It's got a lot of, as David is saying, some growing pains. One of them we've learned again is that the lawyers do need time to consider your case. And so getting to them early so that they can look at your documents and understand a little bit about your situation gives them a better opportunity to consider a defense if they have one. If you arrive on the day of court and they just quickly look at your documents, it's not a lot of time for a lawyer to be able to help you as much as they might be able to.
Yeah, and please, you help us. Exactly. They're limited to and how much kind of what they call navigating they can do. So if you're not sure what your whole universe of documents is before you reach out to the lawyer, where you are in the process, what they would need to see, we're glad to talk to you. That's not a waste of time. It's really a good use of time, because often someone will have another case filed, like Matt was saying, there'll be multiple cases filed against the same tenant, and the lawyer may not be aware of all of them, and if the tenant's missing documents. So we're glad to help fill in those gaps. But no, the positive part of this seems to outweigh it so much, because like Matt was saying, there are notices that are improper, that are issued all the time, and now these lawyers are helping tenants look at them, finding those and saying, hey, no, you put the brakes on this process. As harsh as the law is, like landlords are unlicensed sometimes, have failed to renew their license. Now that lawyers are looking at the tenants' cases, they're able to offer that defense that may not have been there before. So yeah.
I see in the chat, Phyllis, yes, you are entitled by law to have a copy of your lease. If they're not giving you a copy, give us a call. We'll back you up on that. Landlord tenant can back you up on that too. But you are absolutely entitled to get a lease. And by the way, just because they passed the rent stabilization law, the terms of the lease, they're not allowed to change the terms of the lease. They're allowed to change what the law requires, which may mean the amount of the increase. and whatever fees they may be allowed to charge and not allowed to charge. But in terms of the provisions of the lease, they're not allowed to change those terms, as far as I know. We're not lawyers. We just play them on town halls like this and on TV, but that's our understanding. So if there's any issue there, give us a call or email us and let's take a look. Evelyn asks, is there assistance for people that are living with family but not on the lease as far as helping pay rent and utilities? I'm guessing not, because I think that the person who is on the lease would be the one withstanding to seek that support, at least from the county. But I'm not sure what might be available from private sources. Any thoughts on that, staff?
Well, I would, if they're subletting from the main leaseholder, I don't know. There may be a way to just apply as if you have an oral lease and you've been paying rent with the main leaseholder. But I would think that main leaseholder would have to be on board. They would have to probably be contacted and involved, and then along with the landlord eventually too. We should remind people that when you apply for these benefits and things too, then they'll often reach out to the property manager also. But no, good question.
Let's wind up with somebody raised the question about the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General's office does have a consumer affairs division that deals with landlord-tenant issues. But however, they don't pursue them on individual cases. They might look at an individual case in terms of how it might impact a systemic issue. So for example, if a tenant were to complain that their landlord is charging illegal fees, or the tenant were to complain that the landlord chronically screws up their accounting in a way that overcharges you for your rent, the Office of the Attorney General will likely come in not to pursue your case, but if that sparks their interest, that they might go in and look at the entire operation of that property management. But when they do that, they're not going to tell you. So all you can do is file the complaint. Their investigations are confidential until they announce some kind of prosecution. So they can be helpful in terms of giving you advice. They might tell you about what your rights are. But in terms of getting individual enforcement, you'll find more success with the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. Or if necessary, we can help you to get an attorney, either one you pay for, one that's low or pro bono, or one if you're eligible for the Access to Counsel and Evictions program. And Phyllis, I'm sending you a note. Get in touch with us on that one. I'd like to know what's been done and who's helping you and who's not helping you. Okay, if there are any other questions, put them in the chat. We'll give you another minute. Otherwise, we will say goodnight on this rainy night.
I think there was one. I'm not sure if it was answered. It was like earlier in the night, but someone, let me see. Oh yeah, Judy. Did we answer Judy's question about whether eviction notices have an effect on renting other apartments and for how long?
Well, I think we have the answer to that, Tim. What do you think?
Yeah, so they do. So if a landlord files an eviction, it becomes public record. So other landlords can look that information up if they choose. They don't always do it, but they can. And so they might decline to rent to you because of that. And I'm not sure how long the court cases are on public record. Do you know, David or Matt?
I know that they're public record. I know that there are companies, one of them is called CoreLogic, that scoops up this information from the courts and makes it available to landlords, like a credit agency. And landlords can look and see whether or not you've had eviction filings or if you've been evicted. So it does definitely impact your history. There is some consideration of legislation down the road to seal some of those records, but it's a fight because some landlords could genuinely argue that they want to know whether or not you are going to be a reliable tenant or not. On the other hand, Some people receive these filings and they've paid their rent and they have legitimate reasons why they were late, or the landlord made a mistake, and we're not sure whether or not those kinds of actions should count against you in renting a home down the road. So not sure of that.
Yeah. Well, just
Go
a
ahead,
follow-up
Jay.
here, because I think to Deborah's question here, that's, yeah, if you get it dismissed, I think if you pay your rent before and it's dismissed even before the hearing, it's still, I could still go down to the court and find it. It's still there, and there's no law that we're aware of that shields that, unless it's way back during the actual COVID emergency, which has ended. So yeah, we're not, it's, whether it's just or not, I'm not commenting here, but it's certainly, I think, available publicly for quite some time, even if your case is dismissed.
But there is some consideration of legislation to consider shielding or sealing those cases and preventing them from being unreasonably public. Let's move to our good friend and colleague, Pat Beckham. Pat, we're all wearing buttons for a reason. Why?
Because we all need to vote. Everyone should find out who their legislator or council person is for district, and you can find it on your smartphone. Just look it up and do a little research, see what they think about renters, what they've been doing to help renters. And if they aren't any good for us, vote them out. So you must vote. Everyone is so important. Vote.
And I want to point out that early voting is down the road.
Yeah.
So the Renters Alliance is a 501c3 nonprofit, so we don't support any candidate or party, but we do support the idea of everybody being an active citizen and taking advantage of your right to vote. And as Pat says, looking at candidates to see if they hold opinions and philosophy of public policy that you hold. Obviously, the Renters Alliance hopes that they want to protect renters. So I'm going to put in the information to for the Board of Elections. So if you're not sure where to vote or when to vote, that information is right there. So go ahead and take a look. And with that, I think we will certainly consider bringing back Director James Stewart when he's available, when he returns from his trip.
James Stowe. James Stowe. I think James.
What did I
Stowe.
say?
I think you said Jimmy Stewart there. James Stewart.
No,
I
I
think
didn't.
No,
It's
James
late.
Stowe.
James
But we
Stowe.
should.
Thank you.
And we should. It'd be great to have him on, because it was nice to have Councilmember Sales come and talk about the law that his office will be
Enforcing.
overseeing. That landlords should not be asking about criminal history until they've made a pre-offer, and then that should be So I think hopefully Director Stowe can tell us about how they'll be posted and things like that.
Right. So we'll try to get him back when he's available. And of course, if we do get Jimmy Stewart, then that will be quite the draw. So that'll be a big meeting. In the meantime, it's late. Thank you all for joining us. This has been recorded. It's on YouTube. Please share it with your neighbors. Our next town hall will be October 9th. Same bat time, same bat place. So thank you all for coming, and good night.